Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. Now entering the grid. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Jeremiah.
Welcome back to another episode of Turn 1 of Formula One podcast. We're your hosts, Jeremiah
and Thomas.
Today we're going to be going over a recent history of Formula One. Basically, if you just watched your first race 2 Sundays ago and you're confused on why it's important where these teams placed, we're going to tell you about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, it's crazy that we have done 8 episodes already, full length, as well as some special releases.
Yeah.
So we're getting there. But yeah, so we watched the Bahrain Grand Prix, which was 2 Sundays ago now, and for us, it makes sense, right? Things just click. We see Red Bull obviously doing very well. We see the middle of the pack. Well, I'll say middle of the pack, but you see Ferrari, Mercedes, about where you would expect them to be. But then you have the crazy storylines of Aston Martin. But why is Aston Martin a crazy storyline? Why is it normal that no one is talking about Williams or Haas or AlphaTauri? So we're going to cover a little bit of that. Whenever you look back at the grand history of Formula One, who are some of the biggest powerhouses that are still in the sport today?
Without a doubt, I can give you a top 4.
Okay.
You've got Ferrari.
Yep.
If we're talking all-time championships, we're talking Williams comes next. And then it's a tie for third between Mercedes and McLaren.
Yeah. And one of them has been in Formula One for a very long time, and the other is kind of new.
Kind of sad, but that's okay.
So Ferrari is the most iconic name probably in all of racing, also F1.
Yeah.
The iconic color scheme, but also they have the most wins, the most victories, the most championship points, the most champion drivers. Like, they win everything in Formula One far and away. But Jeremiah mentioned Williams, and if you watched the first race of the season, or you watched any of the past 5 years, I'll say 2015 is the cutoff because that was their last kind of decent year. Williams has been a backmarker. When we say backmarker, we mean at the back of the pack of all the teams.
Yeah, it was really weird. Right at the turn of the turbo hybrid era, and if you don't know what that is, that's when the F1 cars turned from V8s to V6s with an electric motor to help out with that. Williams nailed it to an extent for those first 2 years as they came in third both years.
Yeah.
And then it goes down from there.
Yeah.
It's not pretty.
So he mentioned that we're not going to get into a lot into car regulations on this episode, but you will see eras of dominance because a team figures out a car for a particular era of Formula One. In every, 6 to 8 years, they roll out a whole new batch of regulations.
It's about that, yeah. What happens is the FIA decides that some changes need to be made, whether that be a top car is taking off and dominating for too long, we have to keep interest, or just,
safety.
We want to give a chance to the bottom marker team or back marker teams so that they can try and figure it out and climb the rankings. So what happens is they'll have these huge overhauls where a lot of rules are changed, a lot of the specs for the cars are changed or altered in some kind of way, therefore giving middle of the pack or back marker teams a chance to kind of nail the requirements for what it's going to be and figure out a way to not only bring it up to code to the current standards, but then also bring out that extra power behind it to climb the rankings from where they are.
Absolutely. So wrapping up kind of the Williams discussion, if you see them in the race and you're thinking that they're just a bottom of the barrel team and they're not doing anything, you're not wrong, but they haven't always been that way. They are still one of these small, still family-owned constructors. That's what F1 kind of started as. It was some big name companies and then some small family teams. They're the last remaining one of that. They have a dominant history. It's just recently they had a lot of management turnover. The family's gone through some of their family members running the team. They've run in and out team principals. They've had money struggles. And so it's just not clicking right now. But they are not in the same boat or maybe conversation as the other backmarker teams.
Yeah, in the grand scheme of things.
Right. The other backmarker teams we're going to label as Haas and AlphaTauri.
So fair.
Haas and AlphaTauri, the reason we're not really comparing them to Williams is because they don't have a history in Formula One like Williams. They are secondary teams to big primary teams, even though
Right.
that's not on paper
Right.
that way.
Well, basically how that rolls out is you've got Red Bull with their sister team or development team, whatever you want to look at
B
it.
team,
Yeah, the B team.
the scrubs.
And that would be your AlphaTauri. When you're looking at Haas, they have a contract with the Ferrari team so that they can provide engines for Haas. And with that comes kind of an understanding that, hey, we're looking at scouting a couple drivers. Why don't you put them in your seats so that we can see how they do? And then we're going to steal them from you.
Yeah, or we're going to run upgrade packages through you first if we're not sure about them.
Right.
And so Haas entered the sport 2016.
2016.
Haas entered sports 2016. It's an American-based team, although their race operations are out of the UK. They have never finished higher than fifth in the constructors. They had really big aspirations after getting to fifth that they would be a perennial midfield team. Hasn't worked out that way.
No, and then AlphaTauri, kind of the same deal. Never got above sixth, I believe, but they only crest sixth, I think, twice. And then the majority of the time, it's been on average a seventh place finish. More recently, kind of less than
9.
that. But that's not out of the norm for them because in past history or in past years, they also finished down there. So it could just be a wave that they're riding, and we could see where that goes.
And it's kind of strange because obviously neither of those teams has the history that Williams has, but AlphaTauri's been in the sport since the mid-aughts because they were Toro Rosso before. But they never were going to be a champion team because they would always be the Red Bull development team.
Right.
So whenever we have these conversations about Haas and AlphaTauri, there is a chance someday Haas develops into something. It's very unlikely AlphaTauri will ever develop into a champion contender or even a really good midfield team unless they just have some really good young drivers in the car. But Williams is kind of that outlier that can, if they figure out the car, if they get the right team principal, if they get their own drivers and they don't rely on Mercedes to provide them drivers, they can get something together and put a result together on the track. Okay, let's talk about the midfield. Who do you identify as our current midfield teams?
I would probably have to say Alfa Romeo, McLaren, Alpine, and see in there a fourth. I guess Aston Martin you could throw in there. You could throw them in there.
Recent history, yeah. This year might be a different story.
Right.
So let's look at Alpine a little bit. Who were they before they were Alpine?
Alpine was Renault when it was a works team with Renault engines and then the actual Renault team that was doing the actual manufacturing on the chassis and everything.
Yep. And if you are from America like we are and you've never heard of Renault before, they are a European car manufacturer and they're relatively large in Europe. We just don't have them over here.
Right.
So that would be like the equivalent of us having a Chevy team or a Ford team on the track. That's what
to be continued.
Yeah, TBD on that. So yeah, they've been kind of forever midfield. They've always had decent drivers. They have Carlos Sainz. They had Daniel Ricciardo. They've got Esteban Ocon now and Pierre Gasly. They had Fernando Alonso, but never guys that were in the stage of their career competing for the championship. Right. They were on their way up or they were on their way down.
And that might be attributed to them not being able to put the car needed to fight for a championship. They've always been close, I want to say, when they were known as Renault. You had them finishing best of the rest, and that's where they were fighting for because that was, what they were capable of. You didn't see them pushing towards Ferrari, Mercedes, or Red Bull, but that's tough to do.
Yeah. They so whenever you're watching the race and you see your Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon, and you're trying to figure out, especially if you just watched the Bahrain Grand Prix. If you've just watched the Bahrain Grand Prix, I don't know how good of an indication that is of where we sit for the rest of this season or going forward. Aston Martin obviously shot up and did very well. We'll get to them in a second. But when you look at Alpine, last year they were a pretty solid number 4, right? Like that was locked in from the get-go. They were number 4. If you watch the Bahrain Grand Prix, you notice Pierre Gasly started 20th, and you're like, uh-oh. And then you notice Esteban Ocon got 35 seconds of penalties and didn't finish the race. So you have to see how the season plays out. I think that they will still be in that 4 to 5 range. Maybe 6 is the worst case scenario at the end of the year, but they're still a midfield team, and I don't know where they go from there other than trying to get better drivers and better equipment.
I mean, maybe we'll see something different whenever the 2026 rules happen and all the teams are kind of set back to zero per se. Maybe they'll figure it out like we talk about. But other than that, right now, as it stands, best of the rest.
And I really want to get into the eras of Formula One when we talk Mercedes. Let's look at McLaren.
Okay.
You almost had them on your list of dominant F1 teams, right?
Yeah.
Why is that?
McLaren's had a history of success.
Yeah.
5 drivers' championships.
It's pretty good.
Or 6, I think, or 6 constructors' championships, rather, I believe. Yeah, I mean, they have history of being a very successful team, and with us, like, you know, how we talked about in past episodes, with them having all that money because they're being backed by McLaren, which is a huge name, you would think that you would just see more success, but they kind of always just kind of hover, nowadays, they kind of hover around best of the rest, if not middle of the pack. I mean, it's kind of sad to see, but you know, when you're talking about back in the day, whenever they were fighting for championships, when they had Lewis Hamilton, or if you want to go back further and talk about Alan Prost, these were really good teams, competitive teams.
That's where Lewis won his first championship.
It is.
And that's kind of the last time McLaren was good.
Yeah.
07, 08.
Haven't won a race since Danny Rick.
Again, we came into this just in the past couple of seasons, and we know the name Ferrari. We know the name McLaren, right? Those are associated with racing. And there's reasons for that because both of those teams have the history. It's just that Ferrari has continued that longevity into the 2010s and 2020s. McLaren hasn't done that yet. But I remember growing up, it was all some of the conversations at school were always like, who was the newest, fastest production car, right? And forever it was the McLaren. Was it the S1 or F1 or P1?
F1,
whichever version it was the fastest car for a while until it got beaten by the Bugatti. Which that's another story for F1 history. But I mean, you expect them to be good. So if you're watching the race and you're like, that's McLaren, why aren't they winning or finishing in second? There's a lot to it. There is the drivers, there's your personnel, there's how you deal with the regulations, which just got overhauled a season ago. It's facilities. It's how you put an entire team together, not just do you have a good engine or do you have a good chassis? It is 1,000 different things that add up to success on the track. Okay, let's talk about your boys.
My boys?
Aston Martin.
Kind of bounced around a lot. They've been known by many names in Formula One. Never anything, I guess, crazy impressive. They had a win with Sergio Perez whenever they were Racing Point. That's a factor for them.
Yeah.
Now known as Aston Martin, we haven't seen results yet, but that's because whenever they became Aston Martin, they were a backmarker team. So they've been building from that. That was their base. And in doing that, they climbed the middle of the pack and arguably best of the rest, possibly third.
Yeah, they're sitting right now between finishing as a 2 and 4 team. Which is
ridiculous.
A crazy improvement from their 6, 7, 8 years.
Wow.
We spent a lot of time on Aston Martin in our Bahrain race recap. If you want to hear more about their at least start of the season success, go give that a listen. We would appreciate it. But they definitely have shot up. Whenever we talk recent history of Formula One, though, they were borderline midfield, borderline backmarker team. That's why this year is such an improvement. You never see that kind of jump up out of nowhere in Formula One. It's a constant build up or a gradual decline, right? It's never massive jumps. This indicates a massive jump potentially if they can hold it.
Yeah, and the most wild part about it is we didn't have a giant rule change. I mean, we're
not this year.
Yeah,
no.
the next big rule change is 2026, and Aston Martin just decided, nah, we're not going to wait that long.
That 15 millimeters of ride height.
You know,
sealed the deal. That's all they needed. Their car was built for that 15 millimeters of ride height.
No, but you got to give them credit where they abandoned their ideas going into the beginning of this new era with these new rules in the 2022 cars, and they kind of went towards, I guess you could say, more of a Red Bull approach on the side pods and everything else that they've done. That with the backing of the Mercedes parts that they're purchasing. I mean, it looks like they're stringing things together.
And again, that's another name that is iconic. It's known with racing, but Aston Martin's also associated with just kind of luxury and cool. Right. I think they do have a racing history, but they are luxury. They're cool. James Bond car, hand built in England. But here's the weird part about F1. Some of the partnerships are more just name deals. Because as Jeremiah mentioned, they do have a technical partnership with Mercedes. And also, if you go back to in Red Bull's history, they're now Red Bull Oracle Racing. But a couple years ago, they were Red Bull Aston Martin Racing.
Yeah.
Because Aston Martin, the company, was a technical partner of Red Bull Racing.
Right.
And that's why Jeremiah said that Aston Martin was Racing Point and all these other crazy names. In a span of like 3 seasons, they
Force
changed
India.
names like 8 times. They almost went bankrupt and out of business. Like their history in Formula One was in jeopardy.
Hey guys, this is Jeremiah, co-host of Turn One Podcast. We're going to get right back to this week's episode, but first I wanted to let you know where you can go to find us. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Turn One Podcast. If you want to check out our audio-only version, you can check us out on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts at Turn One, a Formula One podcast. For any questions, concerns, you can reach us at trn1podcast@gmail.com. All right, let's get back to it.
Okay, last midfield team you identified, Alfa Romeo. They used to be Sauber. Now they're Alfa Romeo Sauber. They are partnering with who in 2026?
They are partnering with
Audi.
Audi?
Yeah.
Okay, for some reason I was thinking Porsche, but no, it's
They're
definitely
out.
Audi. We just looked that up a couple minutes ago to make sure. Yeah, that's going to be exciting because, Audi's going to be coming in with a presence. And Sauber is one of those teams where it kind of bounces around from being its own independent team to having those technical supports. So, I mean, they were Sauber and then BMW Sauber and then Sauber and Alfa Romeo Sauber. And I don't know if they're going straight into it right now or if they're going to go back to Sauber before they do this partnership.
It could be Alfa Romeo Audi, which seems like a weird pairing of 2 car manufacturers, or it could be Sauber Audi.
And if the rules are that the team can't enter until 2026, then I guess will they go back to the name of Sauber until 2026 when they can partner up?
There's got to be a lot of money behind all this. But they've always been what I think of as the kind of perfect middle of the pack team. They're never really on the bubble of being a backmarker, but they're also never on the bubble of fighting for championships, because again, Aston Martin, I would have put Aston Martin below them every season before this, and you would put AlphaTauri and Haas and Williams behind them, so they had that buffer there, but they also weren't competing with McLaren and Alpine yet.
No.
So Aston Martin kind of jumped them and Alpine and McLaren, and they are now, I guess, on the bubble of being a backmarker, but they do have Valtteri Bottas. He can get them points. They have been kind of a training ground approach for several of the teams, mainly now Ferrari, because like Haas, when we mentioned the backmarker segment, they pull their engines and parts from Ferrari. They also have their drivers.
Yeah, hence why we see names like Charles Leclerc going from Alfa Romeo to Ferrari.
Right. Basically, Ferrari brought Charles Leclerc into the Ferrari Driver Academy, put him on the Alfa Romeo team to build some experience for a couple seasons, and then said, time for the big times.
Which, to be fair, if you're a Haas or an Alfa Romeo, you really think you're going to draw the attention of a Charles Leclerc? No, you have to have the backing of a major team being like, no, listen, this is the guy.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, we'll give him to you for a year, but when he's ripe and ready, we're stealing him away.
Right, exactly. Because like if you are going to have the young F2 driver that is really going to make it the splash in sport, they're going to do like what Oscar Piastri did and go to McLaren, which is not a secondary team. That McLaren would be a primary team.
Yeah.
They're going to go straight there. Everybody else, like your Verstappens and Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc, they started a development team.
Which is weird that we're talking about Piastri not and Max did, considering Max is by far, if I had to guess right now, the best driver out there.
Yeah.
Number one.
Yeah.
Not just because of his standings and results, but if you're actually watching his racing style and his competitive
So aggressive.
edge. Yeah, he's the number one driver. So, but also he wasn't at AlphaTauri, or I guess at that time Toro Rosso very long.
I think that was purely an age thing. I think if they could have thrown him in the Red Bull seat at age 12, they would have. Okay, so that actually brings us into kind of the last in terms of the constructors of a recent history. You're watching the races now, and there's going to be a name that you hear over and over again because that is the 3 most recent years of success. Red Bull.
Oh, yeah.
Far and away.
Oh, yeah. And, that started in 2010 with Sebastian Vettel's win and then those championships.
Yep.
And now this, era where I guess the V6 era started and Red Bull didn't necessarily figure it out the same way that Mercedes did. So then you have the Mercedes dominance era, which we'll get into later. But then Red Bull with the resurgence with bringing in Max. And at first it was exciting because you have Danny Rick, who's the guy at Red Bull, who's winning races, who's getting podiums, and arguably going to be the number one Red Bull driver for a while. Enter Max Verstappen. And all of a sudden, Danny Rick is sweating. And the reason why is because these two were right next to each other all season long.
Yeah.
All season long. So now Danny Rick, who wants the spotlight, who wants the guaranteed number one, jumps off Red Bull, goes
He's
to
a
Renault.
personality.
He is. Jumps to Renault, and Max Verstappen takes the wheel and runs away with it.
And essentially, not one for one, but essentially replaces Daniel Ricciardo at Red Bull, because you can have two number one drivers for a year. You cannot have two number one drivers long term. It doesn't work.
No, man. Both of them want to win.
Yeah. That's why, I mean, we'll get to Mercedes in a second, but that's why you have Nico and Lewis kind of split after a while. Again, one has to take the reins and run away with it. So you look at 2010 to 2014 or 2013, and it is Red Bull dominance. Fast forward 7 years. 2021 is when Red Bull really started to pick it back up again. They were kind of continuously growing throughout that entire time. But then 2022 strikes, Verstappen wins the world championship. 2021 strikes, they win the world championship. 22, they win both.
Yeah.
And then now it looks like they're kind of on track to do that again.
Right. So here again, kind of how we keep bringing up eras. The turbo hybrid era starts and Mercedes runs away with it. Red Bull's trying to play catch up. Red Bull does catch up right at the end of the break, right before the 2022 rule change. And they figure it out and they grab the win for Max in 2021. Enter the rule change. Red Bull's been working on this. You can tell.
Yep.
They've done plenty of testing. They've been doing plenty of scouting. They've been trying to see if they can climb that ladder and completely take over that number one spot instead of this back and forth game that they were playing with Mercedes. And so now the rule change happens. The new cars come out. Red Bull nails it. Right on the money. And because of that, ran away with the whole 2022 season. And, well, you see how the 2023 season is kicking off.
They put a beast of a car on track.
Oh, man.
The thing is a power. And we got a little worried in 2022 with how the season started. Ferrari, which we'll get to in a second. Ferrari looked like they were going to run away with it. And that quickly flipped and never went back to looking like it was going to go that way. So Red Bull is the team of the day, or the team of now. They have been successful ever since they joined the sport in the mid-aughts. They built a really good team. They have a really good program. Christian Horner runs an amazingly tight ship at Red Bull. But who has been their rival for the past 13 years?
I mean, if you want to count their number one rival, Mercedes.
Yeah. Why is that?
Because Mercedes had the dominance, man. We're talking about since the V6 era started until 2021, there was zero people challenging Lewis.
Nope.
Or I guess you can also say Nico and you can also say AlphaTauri, but Lewis Hamilton, right?
Yeah.
So they take off, they run away with it. There's no chance. So Red Bull's fighting for the number 2 spot with Ferrari rather, until that 2021 season. But until that moment, it's just nothing but Christian Horner coming after Toto Wolff, because he's not going to settle for that number 2, whether they take it by a long shot or not. They want the number 1 spot.
Yep. So whenever you're watching a race weekend, the eyes are on 3 teams. I'm going to stick with Red Bull and Mercedes for now, but Mercedes from 2014 to 2021, where they lost the drivers but won the constructors in 2021, all of them all the time.
Oh,
and
yeah.
No one doubted. Every season would pop up. If you watch Drive to Survive, which started in the 2018 season, I think I finally confirmed that was 2018, not 2017. They just mentioned back, Lewis Hamilton wins again, because they're following all the other teams. It was no doubt about it that he was going to win.
Yeah.
And so they had this era where they figured out the car. And also Mercedes did not come into the sport until very late in the game. We're talking about right kind of 2010, somewhere in there.
Yeah, well, they were partners with McLaren.
Right, where Lewis won.
Yep.
But they had their dominant streak really early on, and it's really interesting in Drive to Survive or in interviews or press conferences with Christian Horner, you will hear that he loves to hear see how Toto Wolff is kind of physically breaking right now and mentally breaking, because this is the first time he's undergone a full overhaul regulations-wise of a car last year, and Mercedes didn't get it right.
Yep. Well, Mercedes was doing nothing but trying these experimental things because they're like, hey, nobody's going to catch us. Worst case scenario, this experimental project doesn't work out. We go with the car we have and continue to dominate.
Yeah. Whenever they rolled out their new cars last season, 2022, big regulation changes, huge side pod design differences between all the teams. We will see that gap narrow as the years go over the next 4, 5, 6 seasons, however long it lasts. You'll see the cars start to look the same because they find a car they like and they go with it. Every other car kind of followed either the Ferrari philosophy or the Red Bull philosophy of these big, sweeping, undulating side pods.
Right.
Mercedes is the only one that is tight to the car. They barely have side pods.
Right. And we saw Williams rolling with the Mercedes look when they first brought it out in 2022. Quickly jumped off of that when they realized that it was garbage.
Yeah. There is something about that is not giving them the speed of the other cars.
No, and to your point on the whole rule change and everything else, I recently did some research and basically Toto Wolff summed it up as if the car could have rode at the low height that it needed to, they could have gotten the speed out of it. Oof. But yeah. But because of the fact that it was sitting higher than it should have been, they had a lot of, pulsating or porpoising rather.
Porpoising was a huge
right.
issue.
And because of that, I actually looked into this a little bit further. Lewis Hamilton and George Russell were both not able to take the turns in the normal way because as you're going into these turns, they're bouncing that entire time. So because of that, their back end is also bouncing, which means that their tires are not gripping the road, meaning they're losing downforce like crazy. And what do you need to go into a high-speed turn?
Some grip. And downforce.
You need downforce. So as they're going into this turn and they're bouncing, tires aren't making contact with the ground, no grip, no downforce. Right. So they have to come off earlier or maybe slow down more, meaning they're not carrying that speed into the corners.
The computer, I don't know how their computer simulations work, but it's probably really hard to factor in the driver element of bouncing up and down like crazy. We did an episode, episode 4 was on karting. We had some of our friends on that we've been karting with. Highly encourage anybody that has not been karting to go find your local good karting place, some gas karts or the electric indoor karts. You will quickly get an understanding for the turning difficulties. I'm not going to say of an F1 car, but you'll get the idea of the principle behind the thing.
Yeah, we can't compare it to the $125 million car.
You can't go 40, 50 miles an hour into a turn and expect to make that turn. You can go 30 miles an hour into the turn if your tires are getting the grip and if you're being sucked to the ground the right way in a go-kart. But you kind of feel that as you're going around those turns, you lose the grip and you start to slide and you're like, uh-oh.
Yeah, you can feel it.
And you can feel it. And so that's what these F1 drivers are feeling, just at a much elevated rate.
Oh, yeah, because, instead of 40 miles an hour, they're going 140.
Instead of 1.5 Gs, it's 9 Gs. So, like I said, recent history of Formula One, it is all Red Bull, it is all Mercedes, and it's still those two because right now it's all Red Bull. Maybe Mercedes figures it out and gets back on the train. We'll see. But there's a third team that we only mentioned at the start of this, and we haven't circled back to them yet. Ferrari.
Ah, yes. The Scuderia Ferrari.
Scuderia Ferrari. They are, again, the most iconic team in Formula One, possibly the most iconic car brand of all time. And you're sitting there on race day, and right now you're like, okay, they're up there. But they've always just kind of been up there. It's been a while since they've been the one that's up there.
Yeah, in fact, their last driver's championship was Kimi Räikkönen in 2007.
Yeah, almost 2 decades.
Which, before that, granted, they had their moment.
Right.
Michael Schumacher winning in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004. Nobody was beating them for that solid stretch of 5 years.
Right.
It was him.
But then things start to change. New teams enter. Red Bull enters the mix. Mercedes enters the mix. And it pushes Ferrari to the 3 spot until last season when they bumped up into 2. What is getting in their way? Recent history, what's getting in their way?
I mean, it's not the car. We know this. The car
is
amazing in terms of it takes the corners faster than any other car on the grid.
Yeah.
it's maintaining that speed in the slowest sections of the track, which
It
is
is-
very important.
It is an equal beast to the Red Bull.
They have two drivers who know how to drive, in Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc. These are two guys who were number ones on their previous teams, and Charles number one at the team that he was currently at until Carlos came there. Now, you can say Charles is number one, but it's pretty back and
It's
forth.
a 1A and a 1B situation.
It really is.
Charles was scouted by Ferrari for a long time, put through their academy, comes up from Sauber, goes to Ferrari. Carlos he's just been a legit F1 driver. He was at Renault, he was at McLaren, now he's at Ferrari.
He was at Toro Rosso.
He was on the Red Bull Junior team.
So Carlos Sainz's story is he was on the Red Bull Junior team, Toro Rosso, with Max Verstappen. Max gets elevated to the A team, and Carlos gets loaned to Renault for a couple races in that last season. Next year, full move to Renault.
Yep.
Here's the problem. Renault gives up on Carlos, so Carlos is without a seat. McLaren picks him up. Now you see Carlos starting to build his confidence. You can see his skill with a car that can perform at a decent pace. He's beating Lando Norris. He's getting good results out of it. Boom. Move to Ferrari.
And that was a great move.
Right. So we've covered the car. Excellent. The drivers. Excellent. So what could be going wrong?
Let me clarify on the car. The car, one, looks great. Two, it can perform great.
Yeah. I guess we should talk about durability a little bit.
And reliability. Yeah. So let's start there before we go into the big point.
Sure.
Ferrari engines in a recent history have a tendency to blow up.
To keep it light.
They either blow up and catch on fire, or they just stop working.
Right. And we know the frustration from the drivers, and like in Carlos Sainz, where he had to pull off the road and he was at that incline and the car just catches fire.
Yep.
And so he's trying to get out of the car, but there's no e-brake on this thing, so it's just sliding backwards
on fire.
So he tries to stand up and get out, but it starts moving, so he goes back in and pushes the brake, and then he tries to step out and get up, but he can't because it's rolling backwards
And it's on fire.
And then we have Charles Leclerc, who has to pull over, and his famous
several times,
his famous thing from last year. No.
Yeah. Pulling over, skidding out, all that. But the engine troubles is not just limited to the Ferrari team. It was every team that purchased a Ferrari engine.
Oh, yeah.
There was one race, I have it in my head as having a green kind of track barrier. So it was either Brazil or Spain, one of those two, where like 3 or 4 Ferrari cars DNF'd because the engine went out. It was the Ferraris, the Alfa Romeos, and the Haas's, all with the same engine trouble.
Go figure.
Which is also interesting because just as a this year thing, if you watch the Bahrain Grand Prix, not this year but last year, they showed a couple clips before this year's race that reminded you what happened to Red Bull in last year's race. Both Red Bulls in 2022 Bahrain DNF'd almost at the same time, same lap counts, with the same car issue. So these cars are built in such a finite way
that when one experiences an error, they both do
because
the exact same spot.
They're both running the same track at the same time, same speed. They break the same way.
That is wild.
Yeah.
Jeez.
So Ferrari, their biggest downfall recently, and this is a past 2-year thing. I'll give them credit. 3 or so years ago, they were still figuring out and kind of regaining momentum, trying to catch up to Mercedes at the time. They got the car, they got the drivers. What's killing them?
Dude, strategy. And it makes me cringe every time I watch a race, because you'll see Charles making a move and it looks like he's going to take the first spot or something to that effect. And then you'll just hear something absolutely random like box. And you're just like, what? Okay. And then you'll see Charles come in, or Max will come in and he gets changed to mediums when he's on the softs. He goes to mediums, and then Charles will come in and he gets put on the hards. Or Charles comes in when Carlos is already in the box and he has a slight couple second delay, which in F1 matters.
Yep.
So it's just all these itty bitty little calls. Like, okay, for example, another one, we've talked about this one. Charles Leclerc gets put on intermediates. Everybody else is on slicks.
Yeah.
Even the Williams and Haas's are on slicks. Why can't a top team in Ferrari, multiple championships, why can they not figure it out, man?
They should have the best people at everything.
Oh, yeah. Who wouldn't want to go work at Ferrari?
They have the most money, the most every... And again, yeah, if you're working on Red Bull or Mercedes right now, even you are intrigued by Ferrari. That's why Sebastian Vettel...
That's exactly
he wins at Red Bull 4 times and says, Oh, Ferrari's making me an offer? All right.
I'm out of here.
Let's go to Ferrari. Let's look
no.
just at 2022, and we'll go through some of these strategic areas, because 2022 was the first year they were supposed to be competitive.
Sure.
2020, they were getting the driver lineups in place. 2021, they were starting to get the car in place. 2022 was, we have the drivers, we have the car, and it showed in the first 3 races. They win.
Yeah.
And you're like, great, Ferrari's back, sweet. They have the issues with Charles on the intermediates. Monaco. They double stack the pit stop. Unnecessary. Well, not like they didn't mean to do it. It was an accident. They had Carlos in the pit. Charles was making the turn, that last turn around Monaco before you hit the home straight with the grandstands. And they say, Charles, box. And then he makes that turn. And once you make that turn, there's no going back.
No.
It's not like some of the other tracks where they have a long pit lane where you could dip out of it if you wanted to. Once you make that turn, you are committed to pitting in Monaco. And as soon as he does that, they say, no, stay out. And he yells out some obscenities.
Enter explicit comment here.
Because he was not happy because they were 3rd or 4th in the paddock at the time, or in the pit wall. So he could see Carlos sitting there or pulling in.
Yeah, and the worst part is he goes from 1st to 4th.
Yeah. And that's a big race to win, because whatever spot you're in, you kind of just stay there.
No. That's the biggest race to win.
Yeah.
Because he's a Monegasque.
Yeah, there's that part of it too. Man, okay.
Which, by the way, if you don't know what that is, because I had to look it up, it means you're a native of Monaco.
Which there's not many of them.
No.
The other issue that they had was, again, with tire strategy. They had the race where every other team had run out hards. Every other team. And every other team went 1, 2, 3 laps on them and said, this is bad, came back in and switched them out. Fast forward 7 or 8 laps, Ferrari says, hey, let's try some hard tires. The difference was all the other 9 teams tried it at the same time, right?
Yeah.
There was no baseline. I guess their simulations or track temperatures, whatever, dictated hard tires. Reality says no. Ferrari says, those other 9 teams couldn't do it. We can.
We're
got
Ferrari.
it.
We're different.
And both drivers go out there, and both drivers say, I'm skating on ice. I have no grip. I can't turn. They get dropped in the stand. Like that was one of the horrible races for Ferrari as a team, all because of 5 to 6 laps on the wrong tire compound.
Yeah, so speaking of tire, we can stay on that topic because we talked about the strategy was the main thing that was tearing him down. But there's also another thing, tire degradation.
Yeah. Their car violently porpoised in 2022. Anytime they were going down a straightaway, the drivers just bouncing. I don't know how they see when they're doing that.
They don't.
Just guessing.
These guys, you have to understand, for those of you that don't know, when they're doing the practice sessions and everything, they walk the track.
Yep.
They don't drive the track. They walk the entire track, point out every single elevation change, every single bump, every single crack in the road, every single divot. And they're like, make note of that, make note of that. This should be your braking zone, make note of that. So these guys can basically drive it blindfolded. Probably not, but basically.
Some could. There's a video. There's several drivers that do it, but there's one really good video of a guy that videoed Pierre Gasly doing an entire track. I don't know what the track was. He's legitimately got his eyes closed. He has a steering wheel in front of him, and he is doing not only all the turns, but all the gear shift changes.
Yeah, for context, they put a side-by-side of somebody taking a lap around this track, and he's sitting there with his eyes closed. I can't remember if his eyes were covered or if it was
I feel like there was a
closed.
blindfold involved.
I think there was a blindfold, but the point is he's holding a steering wheel, or possibly not. Anyway, regardless,
he's got something.
Regardless, you can see his hand gestures as he opens DRS right when you're supposed to. He's shifting the right amount of shifts, and you can hear it from the car on the side-by-side. He's doing the same amount of shifts up and down and turning the wheel the exact same amount, the same distance as the car in the side-by-side.
Yep.
I mean, it's crazy how well these guys know these tracks.
So that's why whenever you look at Ferrari, it's been a while since they've won it all. We thought 2022 was it. It was still Red Bull's time. It is currently still Red Bull's time. But as you're watching them, know that they are a competitor. They are going to be in the top 2 or 3 teams at the end of the season if things go according to their plan, the Ferrari master plan. But they're good. They just haven't pieced it all together yet. They pieced together the drivers and the car. They just don't have the reliability and the strategy. They did have a team principal turnover this year, so maybe that has an impact. let's move on to some of the driver storylines. This is what you're going to see played out more in the Drive to Survive series, the drama behind the drivers. Some of it's real, some of it's not. We'll do a deep dive on Drive to Survive. Let's start with the biggest storyline, Max and Lewis.
And that one's always going to be a big line as long as Max keeps winning and Lewis is not. And the first time that Lewis gets that car figured out, or Mercedes figures that car out and gets him a little bit of a pace, we're going to see that rivalry fire right back up. But these dudes did not like each other. I mean,
starting in like 2018, that's when Max was labeled as "you're next."
Yeah.
And it took until 2021, but it's been 6 seasons of Max v. Lewis.
Yeah, and this whole time, Lewis is gaining information on Max and how he has to. I mean, there was one interview where he's like, you have some drivers out there that you need to leave a little bit more room than others for around turn. That is clearly directed at Max.
It's the most violent driver on track.
And then you have, what was it, Max touching the Mercedes back wing, or was that Lewis touching the Red Bull back wing?
They both have clipped each other's back right tire.
Oh, well, yeah, that too. But I mean, like when they got out of the car and they got in trouble for walking over and actually touching the wing. That. Yeah, I want to say it was Max touching Lewis's back wing, but he was sitting, and then they got penalized for it, which is hilarious.
Just breaking it.
Like, no.
You can't break that piece of the car.
No, but you have Max. I mean, Max cares if he gets pole position, always. However, when you're talking about the greatest lap that never was, who had pole position at the time?
Sir Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah. He wanted that. He wanted that for two reasons. One, because he has pole position to start the race. Two, because Lewis Hamilton set arguably what everybody was saying was the perfect lap. So now here he comes, purple, wreck.
Yep.
Now he gets out. All this frustration from wanting to take that away from Lewis, kicks the tire.
It looks like a little kid stomping away.
Yeah. No, these guys do not like each other.
No, they had the 2020. I'll say the 2020 season. They had several collisions because that's when Max, I think, thought he could win it. It just wasn't right. Lewis still had the skill over him, so Max would take these really aggressive lines. He would hit Lewis, but then Max would be the one to not finish the race. And that was the difference in Lewis still being the champion. The year 2021, that season, obviously Max wins the championship, but they go into the final race tied in points. It's because they both raced perfectly all year. If you had to picture a perfect season from two drivers, 2021 was it.
Yeah, the way that Max was able to work that Red Bull honestly blows my mind, because we're talking about a team and a car that hasn't been able to compete with Mercedes for
7 years. Yeah. And suddenly he figured out how to channel his aggression or his aggressive driving style into, I can make these moves, but I'm also not going to take myself out of the race.
Yep.
Or anybody else, because there was a couple times he took Lewis out of the race too. I'm picturing Monza as an incident somewhere in there where he crashed into him. So Max and Lewis dominates the storylines for the past couple of seasons. Recently, though, the conversation has shifted to Max Charles.
Yeah, and that's a direct output of the fact that Ferrari has been coming back into the fight.
Right.
So we saw last year how Ferrari, and more specifically Charles Leclerc, took off with the lead of the Drivers' Championship. He won. Granted, Max was DNFing. However, Charles was putting up a heck of a fight, man. Yeah. I mean, you don't get first. Regardless, you can take Max out of the equation. It's still a Formula One race.
Yeah.
And Ferrari was dominating.
And they were qualifying. In 2022, they qualified better than almost every other team.
Yeah.
They qualified better than Red Bull, I'm pretty sure, in the grand scheme of things, because they had a really good car.
And a really good driver.
It's just that when they had to run more than one lap, they had to start using strategy and reliability. And it didn't work anymore. But that one lap was really good in qualifying.
Yeah. And the great thing about the Charles and Max, I guess you could say, rivalry? Yeah.
They've been rivals for forever.
That's what I was getting into. The thing that makes their rivalry so great is that this isn't something that just recently started. These two have been duking it out since their karting days, and they followed each other all the way up and now into F1. Granted, they took two completely different paths, starting in the same place though, against each other. So now they're in F1 and they're on the arguably two top teams right now, battling it out last year and now this year.
The two top karters follow almost the same timeline. Max a little bit faster than Charles.
Right,
but
because
they're in the same
Max
spot
skipped
now.
F2, and I think Charles did F2.
Max does not have that same history. Max's history with Lewis is strictly limited to the past 5 seasons.
Right.
Because when Lewis was winning his first championship, Max was riding a bike with training wheels. I mean, 07? I mean...
You're probably not wrong. He was definitely in his karting phase still.
The next storyline that you're definitely going to pick up on if you're watching Drive to Survive is going to be Charles versus his own team. Just going to throw that one out there.
Yeah.
Goes back to the strategic moves because the drivers, for the most part, know the right thing to do, right? The example that I'll give you, whichever race it was last year, Charles was running middle of the top 10 somewhere, 4th or 5th, and they said, hey, let's box, let's get you some soft tires, let's go for the fastest lap. You won't lose a place doing this. And Charles says, I don't think that's a good idea. Very clear on the team radio. Doesn't want to do it. And they say, box.
He's like, I don't think that this is a good idea, but I'll do it if you think we should. And then they're like, copy that. Box.
like no thought put into his feedback at all. Like they weren't asking, they were telling what we're going to do. And so he does that. He not only doesn't get the fastest lap, because I think Verstappen also pitted at the same time to do the same thing, although he was way ahead. He loses a spot to Fernando Alonso. So he lost points.
Yeah, and then the Ferrari genius didn't even decide to tell their driver before he was put in front of a camera.
Where the interviewer told him, like, how does it feel to lose a spot? And he's like, I did what now? Carlos does the same thing. Carlos is a little more vocal about it. Carlos will say no. I still think Carlos is a team player. Like, I don't think we're seeing the full story on that. But he is more vocal about voicing his disagreement with the pit walls decisions.
And, that could be a fault to Charles, the fact that he's not willing to take control of his own race when the time comes. Because when you're looking at all of the greatest drivers, they all take the race into their own hands.
And so that's your, I would say top 3, but honestly, Lewis isn't a top 3 guy right now. He's top 5 or 6. But your top 3 in recent history are Max, Charles, and Lewis when you're looking at a 4 or 5, 6 year span. Who is coming back into the picture?
Fernando Alonso.
Yeah, and again, we covered a lot of Aston Martin in the Bahrain race recap. Give that a listen if you're a big Aston Martin fan. But that is, I think, Jeremiah's still favorite driver right now?
100%.
No doubt about it.
1,000%. And he has been since he was on Alpine, and he was doing interviews that always made me laugh. This guy's personality is so great, but then you're talking about his actual driving ability, and it takes it to the next level.
What's a good comparison for him? So if somebody watches the Bahrain Grand Prix 2 weeks ago, and they see a guy out there that's in his 40s, what's the context? Why?
I mean, you're looking at a guy who wants another championship. And the fact of the matter is that he won his 2 very early on. So for the rest of his career, he was chasing more championships. Yep. And the problem with Fernando, what separates him from like a Lewis type or a Max type, the only thing that separates him is that while these other drivers like Lewis and Max, they make the right decision for their career, it always seemed that Fernando was just at the worst place at the wrong time. Like it was... I mean, his jumps, he was on Ferrari when Ferrari wasn't able to produce a championship. He was on McLaren where McLaren wasn't able to help him out. He was on Alpine where he goes back to Renault, which was his championship team, now known as Alpine. And Alpine can't create the car for him so that he's best of the rest? Yeah. Now he's at Aston Martin, and Aston Martin is putting together a winning team.
For race 1, again, just to buffer a little bit.
I'm taking this and running with it.
Yeah, there was nobody for the past 12 years that was going to compete with Mercedes or compete with Red Bull unless you were a Mercedes or Red Bull driver, which he was not. So he dropped from being the world champion twice to being a midfield driver. And maybe now he's seeing that resurgent where he finishes 3rd in Bahrain.
That'd be great to see.
Which is a huge step up, not only for Aston Martin, but for him on a career level.
Oh, yeah. And it would be great to see that as the final outcome of this. If he comes in 3rd and we see Fernando Alonso at 41 or 42 now, I think, on the podium at the end of the year, that'd be wild.
He's the Tom Brady of Formula One.
Yeah, it just never ages.
So the last topic I want to bring up for recent history of Formula One, let's talk second drivers and their contributions, because you're looking at these teams and we're talking about Max, Lewis, Charles, Fernando. But that's just one half of the team. There's other halves of the team that either contributed a lot or have the potential of being a number one driver on that team or another team. I'm going to start with Valtteri Bottas.
Yeah, and we saw what happened to him. I mean, he's on Alfa Romeo now, and he's their number one driver.
Yep.
But before Mercedes, he was actually on Williams, where he was very good.
Yeah, getting single-digit World Drivers' Championship finishes.
Yeah, helping Williams to a third-place finish in the Constructors' Cup.
In 2015. He is obviously driving for Alfa Romeo, like Jeremiah said. So if you're watching the race, you're not really paying to Alfa Romeo. We labeled them as a midfield team. So you're like, what matters? He has the potential to really help that team. He's not going to be there probably for forever. He's not going to be a champion driver there. But maybe if Alfa Romeo is looking for a dominant driver that can push their car to the limits, he's their guy. He's their guy to train a young up-and-comer driver. Maybe that's Zhou Guan Yu. Maybe it's going to be somebody else down the road. But he, not the sole reason, but he's the reason Mercedes won 7 or 8 constructors championships in a row.
Oh, easy.
Well, I'll say the 3 or 4 that he was there, because Nico's the other half of that, which I'll get to. But.
Right. But Valtteri Bottas, I mean, granted, if it wasn't Lewis winning the race, it was Valtteri Bottas
right.
every single time. Now, if Lewis was winning, he was a solid either second or third place in almost every single race. Therefore, guaranteeing Mercedes the Constructors' Championship.
He was basically, so if you're watching now or if you just watched last season, he was what Sergio is to Max.
Yeah, to an extent though, actually this year I would definitely say that. Last year with Red Bull not having the insane dominance like Mercedes had, Sergio would fall to like 5th or 4th. Valtteri was second or third every single time.
Every time.
If not, he won.
And that is a ton of points you're bringing in.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if you have Lewis winning. Some of the others, Sergio Perez at Red Bull, he is in a similar boat to Carlos where he jumped teams. He was a good driver, right? Decent driver, jumped teams, never really found a home or a footing until Red Bull tried some younger drivers next to Max. Didn't work out with Gasly or Albon.
Right.
They say, we need a guy experienced. We need a guy that can defend. We need a guy that can get consistent points so that we can be the Constructors' Championship.
Right. And then they saw Sergio Perez taking that Force India or Racing Point, whatever it was.
Whatever weird concoction of colors it was. It was
they
pink
see him
and green and
taking
blue.
it across the line as numero uno. And they're like, okay, well, if he can do that in that car, let's put him in a Red Bull.
Yep. And he's a guy, we've said it before, the Minister of Defense. He's also the king of tire degradation. He could run an entire 77-lap race in Spa on softs and be fine.
Oh, yeah.
If it was allowed. But that's why they can leave him out there to hold track position. They can leave him out there to provide defense for Max. They can say, hey, Sergio, in the 2021 Abu Dhabi race, hold off Lewis Hamilton. And what does he do? Holds off Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah.
They play a really big role in F1. So if you're watching these races, don't always keep your mind or your eyes just on the number one driver. The number two drivers, one, have the chance to win at the top teams, or two, they are playing a strategical role in the middle of the track, fighting off other people or holding position or allowing tires to run longer than they're supposed to. They play a big part.
Yeah.
Carlo. Oh, good.
Didn't you know? Checo's a legend.
Checo's a legend. Carlos Sainz is he is the number two driver at Ferrari. I know, but he is.
This is where it gets weird.
Skill-wise, he is very close to Charles Leclerc, if not the same. There's a chance he's better, but he is identified as the number two driver to Charles. But we see last year he gets his first win. We said a couple weeks ago, I think that he's going to get a couple of wins this year along with George Russell. This might be where Ferrari runs into a snag. Do they run into that we have two number one driver situations and they're battling too much and it causes discontent on the team?
Yeah, we haven't seen that yet. It seems like they're both satisfied with the fact that neither one of them can win a race. But you know, I feel here's my thing. I see what you're saying in Carlos getting frustrated with the fact that they might be favoring Charles, but at the end of the day, where's Carlos going to go?
Yeah.
If a seat doesn't open up at Mercedes, a seat doesn't open up at Red Bull, I would stay right where I'm at.
I don't want him to follow the Daniel Ricciardo path of trying to find the greener grass.
No, I think he should stay at Ferrari and battle it out.
Let's wrap up our second driver conversation with George Russell. I'm going to propose, is he the second driver?
Yeah, and we can sit here and I'll debate this with you till the day I die. But to your credit, he did finish above Lewis Hamilton. But let me offer you a couple counterpoints.
Okay.
So for one, where was George Russell last year? Or not last year, before 2022.
Yeah, he was at Williams.
Yeah, driving the Williams car. Right. Where was Lewis Hamilton?
He was at Mercedes.
Yeah, driving the most unstoppable, most dominant car in a long time.
7 years in a row, by far the best car on the track.
Right. So we have a guy going from a Williams finishing, 11th is his highest or something to that effect?
He was getting okay finishes.
Okay. Mercedes. He's in a car now where he has yet to finish that far back.
Right.
Lewis Hamilton, however, is going from finishing first, sometimes second, sometimes DNF, but then back to first, to now going to a fourth place car. So it's a little bit different in the respect that I don't think Lewis Hamilton can push that car to its limits because he doesn't trust it. I mean, we heard Lewis Hamilton and George Russell both talking about it, how when they're going into the turn, there's bad porpoising. Now, when this porpoising is going on, that takes away all of your grip from your tires because the tires are now bouncing on the track, but it also takes away all of your downforce, the two most important components in taking turns.
Yep.
So now if you can't take those turns on the limit, but meanwhile you have Max and you have Charles taking it at the limit, there's no way you're going to catch them.
No, and I will say, Lewis has the yellow TV pod.
Yes.
And George has a black TV pod.
Yes. Do you want to describe that for them?
Yeah, so if you don't know, let's say you're watching Bahrain and you're trying to figure out who's the second drivers, who's the primary drivers. You can't see the numbers on their car when they're showing aerial shots. It's impossible. You can't see them in the cockpit. So unless they have the names digitally put on the screen, you don't know who you're watching. Look up behind the driver's head. There is a TV pod. It's because that's where the camera sits for the cockpit view of the car. They are either black or a yellowish green color. And historically, as long as this has been part of Formula One, the primary driver on a team, the number one driver, has the black TV pod. The secondary driver has the yellow TV pod. And Lewis has a yellow TV pod.
Yeah, so let me tell you why this doesn't affect whatsoever what we're talking about. Lewis Hamilton picked that TV pod because it would match his helmet and gloves and number on the car.
Because he cares more about aesthetics than winning.
Whatever. I think that he's been winning so long that he can think about aesthetics and winning.
But you're right. So if you're watching the race, obviously there's our conversation we had about Max versus Lewis and Lewis's run of dominance, and that all still holds true. But when you're watching the race now, Lewis is 3-6 in the standings of the races. Yeah. George is 2-5 in the standings of the races. And so just for context, there has been a power shift in Formula One. Not only has Red Bull taken over as the number one team, but now George is starting to take over as the points earner leader for Mercedes.
Right. And let me just specify, this is a change of power, as you put it, in the eyes of fans. Toto Wolff has not backed this. Mercedes has not backed this. George Russell and Lewis Hamilton have not said anything of the such, and it's very clear who the number one is.
Markability purposes, Lewis is still number one. Who's going to lead all the press conferences? Lewis Hamilton. Who are you going to go to for referencing all the different aspects of what's working or what's not working? Lewis Hamilton.
Right. That wraps up our recent history of Formula One. We want to hear what you have to say. Tell us about your opinions. Tell us about what you think of the Ferrari strategy and the tire degradation. Tell us what you think about Mercedes. Tell us in the comments. We want to hear it.
What did we get wrong on this episode?
Yes, please. If there's any information that is incorrect, please let us know down below. We would love to hear from you. All right. Well, with that, that's all we got. Bye, guys.
See ya.